Hey everybody, it's Medium Brandon Ross, and it is with great sadness that I announce that Pope Francis has passed on April 21st in the early morning hours just after Easter Mass. Pope Francis passed on. Now, when a pope passes on, it triggers a whole chain of events that will happen. They will now go into the cardinal conclave. They will now begin to vote on the next pope. There are days and votes and ballots, and there's arguments for who should take what and which direction it is that the Catholic Church should take. But there's a lot of things of influence that we have to take into consideration here. Not only is the world a larger stage and the Catholic Church doesn't have quite the influence that it once had, but maybe it's what is actually influencing the church that will make up the decisions as to who the next pope will be, if there is going to be a next pope. But this video is primarily about Pope Francis. Let's take a look at who he was and what he was about. First and foremost, being the first pope to be of Latin American descent is super important. Now, his great-grandparents were actually from Italy, so there is some argument here that he wasn't actually fully a Latin American person, but that being said, he was certainly born and raised in Argentina. He studied at the Vatican, he studied in Rome, and he furthermore took his vows with the Jesuits. Now, being the first Jesuit pope actually has its own recognition as well, because the Jesuits were actually kind of deemed as kind of the outside kind of dark horse, if you will, so much so that in their pontiff colors it is actually black, which might come in handy for us to know down the road. But the Jesuits' order is actually very profound. They go by the AMDG, which is in the abbreviation of the Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam, which is basically in the greater glory of God. So their actions and their motto, so to speak, their unofficial motto, was really kind of about, hey, we're here to kind of serve God. It is that of service. That is the reason why Jesuit policy, or at least modality in how they operated, was for those that were less fortunate, people that were marginalized, people that were maybe on the fringe. It was more about kind of going and working with people and not necessarily judging them. How so, you say? When Pope Francis, first of all, when he decided to take the name Francis, it is directly as a patron saint of St. Francis of Assisi. Make me a channel of your peace. He looked at himself as a conduit of God, not necessarily the judgment of God. So much so that when he took office and he addressed the constituents, the first thing that he asked for was for everyone to pray for him, so that he made the best decisions possible, knowing that it was a big job, knowing that it was a big crossroads. There's a few reasons as to why he knew that this was going to be a crossroads, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's also understand that this is a man that was incredibly humble in his approach of things. In the Jesuit order, it is about the service of others. This is why Pope Francis would do things like go to the local prisons and wash their feet. How humbling is that? Can you imagine, say, a political leader doing that today? I don't think so. But in his views, pray for me that I make the least possible mistakes. He's doing a couple of things here. First of all, he's equivocating that you are me and I am you, and that we're not above the plane here. I am not in the seat of judgment here. I am a human just like you. That is an incredible shift to how the Catholic Church has presented itself over the centuries. It's also really important to recognize that Pope Francis really kind of meant what he said. Now, taking a look at the Jesuit understanding as a whole, you have to understand that it's very Christ-centered. There's a competence, there's a consciousness, a compassion, a community, a character, and a culture. The community that they were trying to create was that of dependent interdependence. In other words, it was that you were Christ-centered and you were meant to do the work that Christ put forward. And by the way, some very interesting things that Pope Francis would talk about over his 3 books that he produced while Pope. One of the concepts was that you are Christ and Christ is you, very much the same way that he presented his papacy. He literally talked about it as if it was an Aquarian Jesus, not as if it was the Pisces Jesus of come worship me, which, by the way, Jesuits will be the first ones to tell you at no time did Jesus ever say, follow me or worship me, but more of take my example and be it. In working with the community, it was always about a greater good. It was so that then you would recognize that even in the utilitarian of community work, the weakest among you was the weakest of all of us. Jesuits had a very particular way about how they would approach suffering. It wasn't about suffering was inevitable. It was that suffering must be shared so it is decreased. It is actually a very shamanic way of looking at Christianity. Jesuits also fully expect that Christ, even though Christ being centered, wasn't actually a person. Jesus was a person, but Christ was an energy. The Christos, if you will, was more about the example set to understand how we, each of us, have God within us. Pretty important way to look at things. Now, we can't not talk about anything in the popedom or in the Vatican and not talk about the prophecies of Saint Malachy, also pronounced Malachy, Malachy, take your pick. But in the prophecies of Saint Malachy, it was actually said that the source document of this has been under question for literally since it was found. It was found in the late 1500s, and all of a sudden it had the hallmarkings of another prophecy-laden friend of ours, Nostradamus. Well, there's a lot of links to Nostradamus with this, and the accuracies throughout the decades have actually been insanely accurate. Just taking a look at the final kind of setting here about the Petrus Romanus, that essentially would have been Pope Francis. Now, it kind of gives tie to the idea that this Pope would have been Peter or would have been of Rome and this eras. Well, his roots actually go back to Rome, specifically his great-grandparents, who were actually missionaries. So there's a lot to this that kind of pull together. And when you take a look at the previous couple of popes, and by the way, we could do an entire segment just on the prophecies of Malachy. And by the way, I know some of you are saying, please, Brandon, do one of those. Taking a look at the last few, you have the Gloria Olivae, which was basically the olive branch of peace. And Saint Benedict, in his divine wisdom, like him or not like him, he stepped aside. He did not want to be the polarizing part of the mistakes that he was actually talking about. And the scandals within the church were certainly something that were still alive and kicking with that. And he made some decisions and then he stepped down. The only time a pope stepped down. For that reason, the olive branch was kept intact. And then, of course, you have the Delibera Folia, who is obviously Pope John Paul II. And what's interesting about him is that he is the only pope, or I should not even qualify as the only pope, but he was a pope that was born on and died on an eclipse. And for him to have this sort of accuracy here in the St. Malachy prophecies to be called literally the labor of the sun is pretty insane. So with that here, with the St. Malachy prophecies, essentially in a nutshell, he was to be the last pope here, St. Francis. In St. Francis passing, although another pope may come in, it is no longer a pope that will die in passing, serving God as you would think, but instead it will lead to a time of turmoil. In that turmoil, we will, of course, have some sort of apocalyptic end where the seven hills are at war. In other words, Israel, Palestine, all that good stuff. And that we will no longer know the church as we realize it. And it's interesting because as someone that in my own faith, I have realized that the Catholic Church, and my thesis paper for my degree was actually about the demise of the Catholic Church and how as a business model, it could no longer be sustainable no matter what anyone did. They had lost their way, not only because their product was actually, kind of sort of doing the right thing, and they were no longer kind of sort of doing the right thing. But that led to problems such as attendance, such as recruitment, and such as their product as a whole. So as a business, the Catholic Church has suffered for a long time because of their scandals, particularly stemming from the 80s and the early 90s. But moreover, you have to understand that St. Malachi had this connected. There was another prediction, though. And those of you are going to kind of smile as I bring this up. But Our Lady of Fatima, which just as a little bit of a brief recap, and again, we can do a whole video on this, essentially 3 children were visited by Mary, and Mary gave them 3 secrets over the 3 years. What's interesting about this is that the first prophecy was actually about how the war was going to end. This is during World War I. It happened in 1917. And one of the children actually died in 1919 from the exact disease that they had prophesied about. The second secret was more about how, was literally about communism and kind of about how the Russian states were going to kind of bond together, but it wasn't necessarily a good thing, and everyone kind of needed their sovereignty. The third one remained sealed until Pope Leo in the 1950s actually went ahead and cracked it open. And he calmly put it back together, placed it back in the archives, and said, I wish I didn't open that. In that prophecy, it actually talked about well, he is a saint now, but John Paul being shot and then surviving it. They had also talked about the 4 popes. And now what's interesting about that is that at one time there were the 4 popes that were in attendance, the 2 that were coming, the one that had been in, the one that was in passing, and the one that was engaged. And all of these things were predicted. The last part of that prophecy that was unlocked by Pope John Paul being shot was that there was going to be a literal and subtle demise of the entire Catholic Church. Now it's believed to be said that it actually talked specifically about the scandal in the church, and specifically talked about this time of the St. Malachy prophecies without actually knowing what the St. Malachy prophecies were, as they were rediscovered in the 1940s. Interestingly enough, the last fun thing about this, and by the way, this is one of those things that you sit back and you say, wow, I can't believe it. But one of the key things about the prophecies of both Malachi as well as Our Lady of Fatima is that there is something about the timing. There's an equation about the timing of Jesus and then the longevity of the church until its end. Pope Francis actually wrote a book and specifically talked about how we have, throughout history, actually gotten the actual date incorrect when it came to Jesus's birth. And again, Jesus's birth was more of a hallmark because it was a human, it was a person, and he embodied the Christos, the belief of the Jesus, which, by the way, is something that we really get wrong in organized religion here. We talk about Jesus being the person, and as much as he was the example, the Christos, the energy of the Christ conscious energy, is what Jesuits implored. So you literally have this Aquarian Jesus concept being presented throughout the Jesuit teachings. Pope Francis comes along and gives us clarification, not only on the intention of who Jesus was and how he should be approached, but also on his date of birth. He made it very clear, specifically in writing, that his birth was the 6 BCE, not 0 AD, as many people like to say that, hey, this is the cornerstone and the fulcrum of who we are or of who Jesus is. But instead it was 6 BCE. Now, I can't not talk to you about astrology here, and I'm going to tell you that what happened in 6 BCE was the Great Conjunction. What's the Great Conjunction? That's when Jupiter and Saturn get together in the sky to appear as a star that suddenly appears in the sky. And not only did it happen once, but because of beautiful retrogrades, it actually happened 3 times in 6 BCE. Talk about our timelines lining up here. The way that Pope Francis approached things, and we're about to take a look at his astrology here, was really profound. And he had a ton of assets, not only as a human, but also as a spiritual leader. Taking a look at his astrology, now the inside is his natal chart. On the outside was his time of death. On the inside, he has a sun conjunct to Jupiter, both in the splitsies between Sagittarius and Capricorn. But what's also interesting about this is you'll see that Jupiter is kind of coming up on the opposition of Jupiter. Now, the sixth house having stellium in there means that he's a very kind of private and very, very, how do I want to say this? Conventional way of thinking. He's very much kind of about himself, having the North Node conjunct as well. And other key components for him in his spiritual journey, which I find somewhat interesting, is that he was really about the people. He loved people. You know how we know this from his natal chart? Because his moon and Venus are in conjunct in the seventh house. Now, having Saturn in the eighth house is a way of bringing stability, not only to the secrets of the world, but wanting to uncover them and reveal them at the right time. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Uranus in his 10th house means that he's going to have a very unusual presence. Of course, he was a Jesuit Pope. Never been seen before. Uranus in the 10th house. His career life was definitely in odd bearing. But let's take a look at what happened on the day that he passed. There's a couple of pieces here that are incredibly important as to what is going on, and let's pay attention to Pluto first and foremost. He has Mars in conjunct to his Pluto in his first house. That is kind of a revealing. That is a leveling up. That is a charge forward. That is also the demise. Being in his first house, he was going to identify with himself to either change, evolve, or otherwise go away. To him, in his belief system, thinking that he would go to heaven, meet God, hang out with them, understand the Christos and the Jesus all at the same time, is pretty important. But when you take a look at the astrology, when you look at the opposition of his natal Pluto, Pluto in transit is also, right now, in opposition of his Pluto. And let's not forget his moon. His moon and Venus in his natal chart, conjunct in the 7th house, is also conjunct with Pluto and the moon transiting through his 7th house. That, everyone, is kind of a combination platter of, I'm going to go ahead and leave now. Is that okay? It's his way of detaching, leveling up, being able to say that I'm going to great reveal and emotionally connect with my higher self. In other words, it's a gateway and a portal for him to leave his body. But wait, there's more. Having the sun conjunct to his natal Uranus right now, just moving into Taurus, is the perfect combination for him to unusually leave. And what could be more unusual than, say, I don't know, celebrating Mass at noon the day before and then leaving some 14 hours later? There's no surprise here in any of this. By the way, for those of you that are paying attention to, say, his Saturn, he had just gone through his Saturn return. He has what's known as an early Saturn return, 90 years, give or take. He was 88 years old. He had just gone through it. Again, this is when Saturn happens to be moving very quickly, as it had moved through. It moves through the latter half of Pisces somewhat quick. But Saturn on top of Saturn here in his 8th house is really kind of an undoing that he began to destabilize. And if you go back probably about, 90 days, give or take, this is when he started with his pneumonias, with his challenges, with his sicknesses. So Saturn conjunct to Saturn in his 8th house was the beginning of his undoing. But the last but not least, something like that. Take a look at Jupiter here. Moving into his 12th house. And by the way, this moved into his 12th house about 9 days earlier. And it is conjunct to his Chiron and his South Node. Both are indicators of him either wanting to finally heal and release. And then with the South Node, it is an escape clause. Again, very similar to what you saw with the moon Pluto conjunct to the moon Venus conjunct. Now, in the 12th house, of course, it's the house of the undoing. It is the house of understanding. It is the house of spiritual elevation. Jupiter simply did him a favor to release all of his ills, ails, and wounds to a higher and greater good. I'm here to tell you that Pope Francis died on the exact day he was supposed to. He was ready to release because his lessons had been learned, and moreover, and probably most importantly, he was ready to go. He was ready to return to whatever that connection is, and moreover, he was someone that taught the world kindness. He has those aspects in his chart. I pointed out a few of them, not the least of which the moon and Venus being in conjunct in his 7th house. He looked at humanity as a great partnership. He looked at community as a great understanding. He's also willing to say and be someone that was without a doubt a leader among people. He did some great things, like he did when he first was named Pope. He asked everyone to pray for him. In other words, he's like, I'm not above you. Please pray for me that I am as human, that I do the best I can in this human form. He also did some pretty cutting edge things. He was very outspoken about the ills of the Catholic Church. He had no problem tackling those things. Did he handle every situation correctly? There's arguments as to whether or not he perpetuated some of the old policies or if he was simply not addressing them the way that he should have. But one of the things that he did that was very interesting to me, and it made a lot of people think about how their relationship was with the church, was he did a broad-based understanding and forgiveness of anyone that was divorced in the Catholic Church. First of all, he decreed that you could remarry in the Catholic Church and keep your faith. Now, on one side of this, you can look at it as a recruiting move, and by all intents and purposes, it kind of was. But it's also the cutting edge part that he was willing to accept people as humans, no matter what their challenges were. People could respect Pope Francis for a lot of things. He also stood up to heads of state, and without getting into particular things like jackasses of the United States, let's just not sully this by saying Pope Francis had no problem going tete-a-tete at the table with those that were oppressing others, whether it was wars in Ukraine or, let's just say, spoke up and he spoke out. Because at the end of the day, the people he wanted to support were those marginalized people, because he literally does see us as one. He's been an example of what we need as we move into the age of Aquarius. And sometimes organizations aren't able to pivot. Sometimes they die on the vine. Sometimes they're so stuck in their old ways that they can't move forward. Pope Francis gave the Catholic Church hope that there was a half a shot that they could evolve into something that could be of the people and of God at the same time. And for that, a light has been put out. A light that the world has needed for a very long time. Too little, too late, maybe. But that doesn't take away from the uniqueness of a man that set an example and spoke his truth. Heart taps to you guys and to the 1.4 billion Catholics around the world that are now searching for a new leader. Might I give you a little hint? It won't be in the Vatican. It'll be in you. Keep going.